These are the video instructions for assembling the LED and 7-segment interface board. Real quickly, the components that we're going to be using: a resistor, 330 ohm resistor, 4 capacitors, small LED, the 12 hours LEDs, 7-segment display for minutes, a header for making all the connections, 4 integrated circuits, and 2 resistor networks. For assembly, I'd recommend using a PCB holder like Helping Hands or this pivoting holder here. We'll start with R1, which is a 330 ohm resistor. You want to bend the leads fairly close to the body and insert it in the circuit board. Make sure when it's inserted that you bend the leads at a little bit of an angle to hold it in place. And I usually solder one lead and then check to make sure it's not bent up like that. And then if it isn't flat, reheat that lead and push it in before you solder the second one. My bad, there is another 330 ohm resistor which is labeled R22, and that needs to be soldered on the right side there. It goes vertically on the board. Next we'll solder LED 1. It has a flat on one side, on the right side here, and that corresponds to the flat over on the silk screen. Also, the longer lead is the positive lead, and that's the lead that will go into the left side of the circuit board. Next we have these 4 ceramic capacitors. They're labeled 104 on the top, which is a value of 0.1 microfarads. So that's the locations for those 4 capacitors on the board. Now, typically we don't put all these parts in and then solder at the end. We usually solder them as we go along. So I'm going to make a couple solder connections here on the capacitor. Again, I'm tinning that tip of the iron a little bit, applying the solder, make sure it completely covers the hole, and cleaning off between each solder connection. And again, you can solder one pin and then make sure that the component is sitting flat before you solder the second one. What I do, if it's sticking up, I'll reheat that and push it from the other side to make sure it's in place. Same with the LED, so that it's not bent at some angle here. I'll straighten it out and then solder the second lead. Making sure that it's flat to the board and not sticking up too far. Next we have the 2 resistor networks. These are 330 ohm networks. They're marked 331 on there, so make sure you check the part number. Also, the notches indicate the end where pin 1 is. On these parts, often the leads are bent out at an angle, so you have to bend them flat, like on a table, to make sure they plug into the board. On the board, those are notated as RN1 and RN2. And again, make sure that those marks, the little notches, are facing up. So in soldering the resistor networks, I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to bend these leads out a little bit on the corners. Whoops, that other one fell out. Probably do these one at a time would work a little bit better. You don't need to bend them completely flat, but bend them at enough of an angle so it stays in place. And I'll do the same thing here where I'll solder one pin and make sure the package is flat before I continue. Again, before soldering, double check and make sure you've got them in the right locations. These resistor networks should be on the inner 2 sets of socket pins. So I'll solder a couple corners here and make sure the package is flat before I continue. And that looks like it's raised up a little bit on that side. So I'm going to reheat the connection and push it up a little bit. Yeah, now it's a little bit flatter. I'll go ahead and solder the rest of those pins. And so on. Oops, that one's not soldered very well. There we go. You want to make sure each pad is covered and it creates a nice fillet or kind of a conical shape when it's done, that you don't have too much solder or it's a big ball on the end. Next, we're going to solder the 12 LEDs. Again, make sure that you check and see that the flat side is lined up with the flat side on the silk screen on that side, and the longer lead is the positive lead. That's going to go on the left side of all of these. So when you solder them, again, place the LED in there, bend the leads out a little bit, and again, I usually just tack one lead and make sure the LED is soldered straight instead of bent or lifting off. And then once that's done, go ahead and finish soldering the rest of it. Next, we'll solder the IC sockets, and again, we want to make sure the notch that you see on the top there aligns with the notch on the silk screen. And we're going to do the same thing. We're using sockets so that if the IC is damaged or gets soldered incorrectly, that we can replace it easily. And again, we'll flip it over, bend the lead, solder it, just like the two dip resistors that we completed. Next is the LED display. The thing that's critical here is to make sure that the way that the digits are slanted follow the silk screen on the circuit board, and that the decimal points line up on the same silk screen there. It takes a little bit to kind of get these in if the leads aren't bent perfectly straight, but you can clip the leads on the bottom after you solder those. At this point, your board should look like this. Don't plug in the ICs yet. The very last part we have to solder in is this little 15-pin socket. That's how we'll connect all the pins to the Stemterra board or the breadboard. So here's the completely soldered board. Before you finish up, double check all the solder connections on the bottom. Make sure all the pads are completely covered and you don't have any bridges between the different solder points. When you're done with that, the last step is inserting the integrated circuits. The two ICs are 74-138s that you see on the top there. I'll see if I can do a close-up of the chip. So this is a 74-138, and again, notice the notch on the top there. That's going to plug into these two sockets here, and the notch is on the left-hand side. And the last two ICs, are the 4543s. Make sure you check the part number. And again, you see the notch, and make sure that's oriented the right way. And those are soldered here. That's IC4 and IC5 facing up. So those just need to be bent. The leads, you'll have to bend them because, again, they're bent out kind of like the way you saw before. If you just bend them flat on a table so that they're at a nice right angle to the package, you should be able to plug them into the socket fairly easily. Okay, so that's the end of the instructions for this. The next video will show you how this is actually used with the Stemterra board.